and welcome back to Chris Story Studios. In case you missed last week's episode, we've really started our story proper. You've been introduced to CJ, a normal kid who just wants life to go back to normal. But as we're about to see, it seems like that problem of his is going to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. I don't want to spoil anything, so I'll leave it right there. But, well, stick around, and you'll see where this story goes from here.
Chapter 2 An Unexpected Message. CJ used to think that school went by slowly on normal days, with normal classes. It turned out that this phenomenon increased tenfold when it came to the last day of the year. Each period seemed to crawl by at a pace that would make a snail seem like a sports car. The only silver lining to this was that there were no tests today. All the finals had been finished the week before, giving the kids time to kick back and have fun. Well, at least as much fun as one could have surrounded by people he didn't like. When he and Max finally reached their lockers in the hallway, other kids were filing into their classes. The bus driver had dropped them off a little late, making time closer than CJ would have liked. He quickly deposited his backpack in his locker and started walking down the corridor. The day would go a lot easier if he shared any classes with Max, but the two only had the same science class. At least they'd see each other in the cafeteria. "See you at lunch," Max called as he walked the opposite way. CJ echoed the words as he made his way down the hall. Math was his first and most dreaded class. The only good thing was that Mrs. Johnson was pretty nice, and probably wouldn't assign homework. At least, CJ hoped she wouldn't. Some teachers had the nasty habit of giving kids work to do in order to sharpen their skills during summer break. He was, of course, very opposed to the thought of working in those 3 months. Or in general, for that matter. When he entered the classroom, he found most seats were already claimed by students. He quickly took his own, ending up near the back of the classroom. That was more than fine by him. While Mrs. Johnson was nice, that didn't mean she and him were on good terms. The woman seemed to have a talent for sniffing out trouble. And, try as he might to keep his nose clean, it seemed Havoc had taken a liking to him. Over the past year at Stafford Middle School, CJ had gotten a lot of attention from the teachers. The label of a troublemaker had been pasted onto him by his second week there, when he had microwaved the guts of the frog they were dissecting. The stench had been so bad in the little science building that 3 of the students puked in the trash can, and Mr. Thompson had been forced to evacuate the classroom. All of the windows had been left open, and it still took an additional 2 hours for the place to smell normal again. The weirdest thing about it was that Mr. Thompson had let him off with a warning. CJ hadn't seen him smile the same way since. It was only later in the year that CJ had learned his biology teacher didn't have a sense of smell, which was why he didn't think the prank had been too harmful. But the other kids complained, and CJ had gotten detention as a result. Thus began his troublemaking legacy at the middle school. But there was no way that Mrs. Johnson would put up with anything like that. If he tried any funny business in her class, there'd be detentions to fulfill, which meant he'd have to be on his best behavior throughout first period. And the ones after that, now that he thought about it. He couldn't very well draw attention to himself with his locker currently full of enough fireworks to take out a city block. Well, perhaps not that many. Still, contraband was contraband, and he doubted the quantity would matter much in his sentencing. CJ settled in his seat and did his best to look as innocent and bored as possible. It wasn't difficult, at least the second part wasn't. But as he watched Mrs. Johnson get up from her desk and take her place by the whiteboard, the air around her began to change. CJ suppressed a sigh as the otherworldly glow shimmered in and out of view. Even after months of dealing with the phenomena, it always managed to sour his mood. Mrs. Johnson emanated a hot pink light, one that never seemed to touch the classroom beyond her. The tiles underfoot reflected the light fixtures overhead, yet CJ once again confirmed that there was no such reflection of his teacher's halo. CJ pulled his gaze off Mrs. Johnson and turned his attention to the desk's surface before him, practically glaring at it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the hallucination grow dim before disappearing. That seemed to be the only sure way to get them to go away, other than sealing his eyes shut. But since that wasn't really an option, CJ had gotten in the practice of keeping his eyes down and away from the people around him. That way, he could almost pretend the odd sights didn't happen. Almost. CJ spent the rest of first period staring at that stupid desk, focusing on it in a vain attempt to keep the strange sights from coming back. For the most part, it seemed successful today. Every now and then, he'd catch a glimpse of one, but sealing his eyes shut for a minute dispelled the image. Still, it was agonizing, and even when relief did come, it came with a cruel twist. "Which of you haven't cleaned out your lockers?" Mrs. Johnson asked as the class neared its final 15 minutes. CJ kept his eyes down, but he slowly, begrudgingly, raised his hand. Sure, he could have lied, but Mrs. Johnson could probably smell the dishonesty even from there. His gaze quickly snapped up to the room around him to find that no other students accompanied him. His teacher mumbled some disapproving remarks, and he could feel her gaze follow him critically as he made his way to the front of the class and out the door. As glad as he was to see a nearly desolate corridor greet him, that did little to help his mood. The faculty had told them to have their lockers cleared out the day before, but CJ had neglected the task intentionally. Leaving it until today gave him an excuse to have his backpack, and all his prank supplies, securely locked in a safe rather than lugged around with him all day. But now that had to change. His first two attempts to put in the combination were foiled by his shaky hands and unreliable nerves. On the third attempt, he popped the small door open. His pack lounged lazily on the middle shelf, accompanied by an odd assortment of papers and sketches he'd left yesterday. With a grimace, he unzipped his backpack just enough to slide the scraps of stationery inside. It only took a couple minutes to clean off all the other surfaces, leaving his locker eerily empty as he shouldered his backpack once more. But as he was about to shut the door, something caught his eye. There was a piece of paper that had apparently been hiding under his backpack, one that didn't look familiar to him. Unlike all the crumpled messes that often occupied his locker, this particular slip of paper looked old, yellowed with age. CJ stooped down and snatched it off the shelf, finding that it felt thicker than he expected. And when he turned it over in his hands, he found that it wasn't a piece of paper, but an envelope. A dark, crimson wax seal held the flap down, hiding the envelope's content from the outside world. A simple insignia had been pressed into the wax, a capital G with a straight sword stabbed downward through the letter. Other than the extravagant seal, no words marred the envelope's surface. No address, no name. But that wasn't the only thing that puzzled him. He dropped off his backpack less than an hour ago, and he was certain that this envelope had not been present then, which meant it had been placed in his locker since first period began. Question was, how? CJ glanced at the slits in the door near the top and bottom, but they were too narrow to slip the letter through. And even if someone could have slid it inside, that wouldn't explain how it got under his backpack. An alarming realization began to settle in his mind as he stared at the note, his gaze periodically shifting to the shelf. Someone had opened his locker and put this inside. On a normal day, that might have spooked him a little. After all, no one liked their privacy being invaded. But with his backpack full of contraband sitting there today, he liked the notion even less. He scanned the envelope once more, examining it as if it would tell him the answers he wanted. But all he found were more questions. Why had someone put it in his locker? And what was that insignia on the wax? Who had written it? It seemed unlikely that staring at the envelope would give him any more answers, so CJ turned his attention to the seal. Presumably, whatever was contained inside might shed more light on it. CJ carefully broke the seal and pulled the letter out. 10 words. Scrawled along the aged paper in black ink were 10 simple words. Dear Connor Jason Blake, tell no one about your visions. Yet, for being so simple, they sure did a good job of making his head spin. He read and reread them more than once, clutching the parchment tighter as if to keep it from disappearing. Any hope that the letter's contents would put him at ease was immediately dispelled, leaving him trying to make heads or tails of what he read. The address itself was troubling to him, for one thing. He had started going by CJ after his dad died, long before he started at Stafford Middle School. The only people he could think of that would know him by that name were his mother, his older brother, and Max. But it was the latter half of the short letter that really befuddled him. Tell no one about your visions. He had to suppress a bitter laugh. Visions. That seemed quite a pretty way to describe the hallucinations that had been afflicting him for the past few months. They had been harmless enough at the beginning, such as with those weird glowing halos around people, if he stared too long. But they'd only gotten more vivid, more obtrusive. And had only gotten worse when they were joined by those dreams that made it difficult to tell where his sick mind stopped and reality began. But the really confusing thing about the note was the fact that those hallucinations were a closely guarded secret. In fact, CJ had confided in only a single person concerning them, Max. As that realization hit him, CJ's understanding of the paper in his grasp suddenly shifted. What had felt so heavy only moments ago now seemed almost laughable. Max was the only one who could have written the darn thing, which meant this was not some cryptic note from a mysterious writer. It was his best friend's attempt at a joke. CJ shook his head as he shrugged out of his backpack and slipped the envelope into his side pocket. He tried to bury his anxiety and annoyance with it, though the latter seemed to cling to him. He had actually been panicked there for a minute, up until the mention of his hallucinations. Max probably knew the combination for CJ's locker, so that question was immediately answered. But the fact that Max had poked fun at CJ's hallucinations certainly wasn't cool. His friend should have known better, especially considering what a sore subject it was. A few questions remained, such as why Max chose that insignia and when his penmanship had improved so much. But one thing was for certain. His best friend was going to get an earful about it at lunchtime.
Well, that problem seemed to solve itself almost immediately. Now we know the letter came from Max. Or maybe not. I guess the only way for you to find out is to come back and check in next week for Chapter 3, Questioning Sanity. I'll hopefully see you next time.